Live, we're good? All right. Well, let's get going. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our biannual crime stats briefing. We do this twice a year. We used to do it once a year. We several years ago just decided to start doing this every other year, or excuse me, every 6 months, twice a year, to just make sure we're staying transparent and letting everybody know what's happening with trends in our city and our community. I guess before I get into any of the details, I'm going to start with just like the overall theme of what you're going to hear today. And what you're going to hear is crime is very manageable in the city, continues to remain very manageable. And secondly, the work of our partners, Sioux Falls PD and our partner agencies that we work with, is extremely effective. I mean, the fact that we're here with the state's attorney, with the sheriff's office, with the city of Sioux Falls, that level of collaboration is why you're going to see some of the successes that we're going to talk about today. So really proud of the partnership we have with those other agencies. That collaborative approach also plays out in what we call Safe South Dakota. Safe South Dakota is a group of agencies across the state, from the DOC to Pennington County partners, Lincoln County, Minnehaha County, to continue to work on crime issues, legislation, things that we're seeing from a statewide perspective. And that partnership has just been very, very effective. That's a monthly call that we have. And to my knowledge, first time we've done something like that level of collaboration. So that's really starting to yield some results too in terms of legislation and bills we're looking to bring forward this next session. So on the next slide, you'll see that overall, these are the stats we have that we're going to talk about just through 23. I know we talked about some of these earlier in the year as well. We're going to just reinforce some of these as well because we don't have the full year numbers yet to show on this. A lot of what Nick, Assistant Chief Cook, is going to talk about here in a second will show our year-to-date numbers. I'm going to talk about some more global themes. And the thing I want to highlight on this slide continues to be this violent crime per capita line. When I'm out in the community and people ask what's going on with crime in the city of Sioux Falls, if there's one indicator I can tell anyone to look at, don't look at, well, we had 2 homicides last month or we had an increase in stolen cars last month. I look at what's going on with violent crime per capita. Because as we're growing by 5, 6, 7,000 people a year, we are going to have more crime. You just will as you add more people. When that number, per capita number, starts to increase at a disproportionate amount according to your population, then you do have a crime problem. So right now in 2023, you can see our lowest per capita number for violent crimes since pre-pandemic. And so that is a really, really important stat that we want to continue to highlight. On the next slide, our calls for service have ticked up as well this year. We've stayed pretty consistent around that 86,000 mark, up to about 89,000 this year. There's a few things potentially driving that. I'm going to let Assistant Chief Cook talk about that. One is we're doing a lot more with traffic, with nuisance driving, and we're also encouraging more people to report things, see something, say something, so that we know what's going on, and that's been successful. So we have had more calls for service this year as well. And like I said, Nick is going to unpack that a little bit more here in a minute. On the next slide, before we get into the actual crime stats, obviously suicide is not a crime, but this is a time twice a year when I like to use this platform to talk about what we're seeing with completed suicides in our community. Our police, fire, first responders respond to these calls. So when we talk about trauma and the challenges of the job, 19 times this year, our first responders have had to come across suicide in our community, notify family members, and deal with the fallout from that. We saw a pretty big uptick through August of last year when we were already at 27 completed suicides through August of last year, January through August. This year, we're back down to a more normal level with about 19 completed suicides today. Is that still too many? Absolutely. Would love if there was no bar here, but just always like to use this time to just remind people you can call 988 if you're experiencing mental health challenges. Check on your friends, and as Vera likes to say with their campaign, ask the question, and that question is, are you having suicidal thoughts? Not, hey, are you doing okay? Are you having thoughts of harming yourself? And so if anyone in the community is experiencing that, please call 988 and check on your loved ones. So with us this time to give our crime stats update is our Assistant Chief, Nick Cook, and he's going to dig into what we're seeing so far in 2024. Thanks.
Thank you, Mayor. Assistant Chief Nick Cook, COOK. First stat we're going to start with was obviously the most important one we have in the city of Sioux Falls. Through the end of September 2024, we're at 8 homicides. So if you look at the graph, obviously concerning when you look at what we went through last year and in 2021 with super low numbers. We were fortunate to have those numbers last year. I hate to say we're average of where we should be for the city of Sioux Falls because we talk about what we had for suicide and stuff. We would love to see that number lower, no bar, but with the city our size, it's just kind of what we have been dealing with. And then we'd like to unpack like what happened in each case, and we're still working through a couple of open ones, as you guys know. But each one has its own nuance, its own set of circumstances of why and when they happen. So again, one of those numbers we don't like to see up at 8 at the end of the year. 2020, if you remember, was one of our largest years of 13. Never want to meet that benchmark again. We will work with what we have for this year and go through that. So obviously concerning when they're up, but again, they each have their own set of circumstances. So next one, again, this one ebbs and flows. We've talked about it in the past. We've been kind of staying steady average. If you look straight across the bar, we're kind of in the middle. We did see a decrease from last year's jump in aggravated assaults. For a variety of reasons that may happen. There's really no great explanation. TUM always likes to talk about our partnership with nonprofits in the area. Those have been things that have been super beneficial to help keep our numbers down, work with the victims of the crimes, and get through those cases as they come. This one, actually, and if we ever go back further, you'll see this spike up and down through every other year. There's really no grand explanation why that happens. Domestic assaults are very concerning when they happen. Again, we talk about that partnership being super important with the nonprofits in our agency to help victims of these crimes. Those continue to be super important. We're just back on our jump cycle for the every other year of why these assaults come up. So, robberies. Robberies are trending down from the last 3 years. Again, we had that spike 2 years ago, which had a lot of victim-on-victim crime, transient crime, where something was physically taken with force. We talked about it in the past. Robberies are classified anything taken by any sort of force, whether it's physical force or with a weapon. Saw a jump in that, and gratefully we're seeing a slight decline in that. Stolen vehicles we've been harping on for, I don't know, forever. This year we did join with some council members, some community members about an ad campaign to bring attention of why we asked the public to lock your doors. And the simple version of it was we're making it too easy for criminals to capitalize on taking our cars. So we're at a 9.5% decrease for this year compared to last year after we started this campaign. So I would like to think that the community is doing their part to help lower this. Is 950 stolen cars in 9 months a lot? Absolutely. So we can do better. I think we're doing a great job. It was a great start over the last couple of months when we're bringing that attention to, hey, let's not give them the opportunity to steal our cars, steal our stuff, steal our weapons in our car. Let's secure our property, take care of the community, because a high percentage of these are being used for something else. We jump back to the violent crimes that we were talking about earlier with aggravated assaults. You know, probably 70, I'm just throwing a number out there, probably 60 to 70% are using stolen cars to commit these other violent acts because it conceals their identity by not using their own vehicle. So keep up the good work in the community, lock your doors, don't make it easy for people to steal your car. Drugs seized. First stat's going to be talking about the methamphetamine, which the past few years has been the biggest drug in our city. I'll show you the next slide here in a minute. Methamphetamine continues to be the largest seized drug that we have in the community, 64 pounds so far this year. somewhat close to the last few years. Marijuana is down to 26 pounds versus a jump the past years, and these can be easily articulated of why is it so low. Is usually it has to do with 1, 2, 3, 4 large cases where a large amount is seized. This year we just haven't had a large amount of marijuana seized in any particular case, and there's a drop in that weight. So again, methamphetamine's been maintaining fairly steady on that, but marijuana has had a drop. So
do you think that the legalization of medical marijuana has helped that number too?
it's tough to say really, because these are large seizures that are coming through, the ones in the past years of several pounds, and you don't usually see that in the medical world. So it may have some impact. It'd be very difficult to track that, but is it possible? Yes, but these are like the large dealers that were getting pounds of marijuana, not somebody that has a couple grams on them or something of that nature. Next stat is the blue or light blue is the cocaine seizures, yellow, which you can barely see, is heroin, and then the dark blue is fentanyl. What I referenced to the marijuana drop, these are probably 3 or 4 very big cases where a large amount of fentanyl has been seized and a large amount of cocaine has been seized, creating this huge spike in our numbers. Again, it's nothing of necessarily concerning, but what is concerning to know that it's coming into our community. So back to, you see something going on, you got to say something, and that's how these things come in through Crime Stoppers. We can build cases on people, and we end up with these seizures of a large amount of drugs. So again, these are a couple of large cases, and you probably won't hear about them for a while because of the nuances of the case or certain things going on, still background to work on them, other people too getting arrested or involved with that. So finally, our overdose numbers, we did see a decline after the large jump 3 years ago. Across the board is any overdose that we log. So those are people that make it or don't make it. Our Narcan use is in the middle. We have dropped off of Narcan use. Not really necessarily a great explanation for that. All our officers have it available to them. All the medical people have it available to them when they respond to a scene. We use it or don't use it, depending on what they're seeing. But what is concerning is we dropped way down to 10 last year at this point in time, and we've jumped back up a little bit. So something to keep an eye on of the why. Sometimes that has to do with the amount of fentanyl or other opioids that are coming into the community. But again, there's been a 4-person jump in the overdose deaths so far. And with that, I'll turn it over to State's Attorney Daniel Hager.
Good morning. Thank you for opportunity to, stand with the mayor, the Sioux Falls Police Department, the Sheriff's Office. I appreciate this opportunity. It's important that we have this leadership as we address, violent crime, nonviolent crime, and those trends that we see. The State's Attorney's Office remains committed to justice. We do that through personal responsibility. Especially with violent crime, we're looking at incarceration as a way of achieving justice. There can be education, there can be restitution, lots of different ways for us to achieve that justice. I do want to talk about the homicides. I have a tremendous amount of confidence in the investigations that our law enforcement does. It feels like a big deal when you have a lot of homicide in a short period of time. Right? That's why they look at those year-over-year numbers. But know that we have good law enforcement. They're investigating those cases well, and they're presenting my office with the best case that we can get to prosecute. So know that when those moments come where we have 2 months of a spike in those crimes, that there is a lot of work behind the scenes that's being done. One of the things that's very important in those cases is cooperation with law enforcement. When law enforcement is talking to you about what you witnessed, be willing to do the hard thing and talk to them about what you saw. Right? That matters. That helps them create better investigation, helps give me a case that we can get convictions on. When we look at how to be tough on crime, I think we have to be long on that strategy, right? And that's where these partnerships matter. We're trying to create targeted law enforcement priorities, right? As they're out there doing saturations, we're making sure that we're talking with them and we're making sure that we prosecute them in the right way. As we see those issues, it's important for police, prosecutors, the court system, probation, parole, to all be aligned in that vision of reducing violent crime. We can look at numbers and feel good seeing decreases in that, but we can never get complacent. It's important to keep striving for less of that, because those are people, there are victims in those cases. When we look at those strategies, targeting things through legislation, right? We have the legislature coming into session in January. We've worked with the chief, the mayor, the sheriff. We're crafting right now legislation to target some of that reckless driving, that racing, that behavior that's really dangerous on our streets. We're drafting that right now. We must have safe roads. It has to be a safe place to drive. Some of that's happening in the middle of the day. That's not acceptable. So I anticipate that we will have a strong push in the legislature for legislation that will make our streets safer. We can continue to invest in technology. I think you see the city council, the mayor pushing for technology in law enforcement. The county commission does the same thing. They've supported my office. We need to continue to move forward so that we're in the best position to handle those spikes in crime when we do see them. I think the community as a whole, our strategy for crime can be investing in our youth. Money's great, time is better. Finding those youth and spending time with them, trying to keep them out of our court system. To those efforts, my office had 384 successful juvenile diversions last year. That was up from 279 the year before. Those efforts are keeping youth out of our criminal justice system. Get involved with kids, show them that you care. That will pay dividends short term and long term. Neighborhood level, again, this goes back to that homicide. If you tolerate crime happening in your front yard, on your street, that will only grow. It'll affect our neighbors, our community. Please cooperate with law enforcement. Tell them what you saw, right? That's how we can, as a community, really combat that violent crime. If you say, I'm not going to tolerate that in my neighborhood, they'll quickly run out of a place to commit that crime. So I'm proud to, again, be here with our law enforcement partners. I'll pass the baton to Chief Deputy Jeff Gromer.
Good morning, Jeff Gromer, Chief Deputy with the Sheriff's Office. I just want to touch base on some of the stuff that's going on with the Sheriff's Office, primarily in the jail side of things. This slide is a slide that we tend to look at every month, tracking our jail population. What you can really see is the lighter blue bar across the bottom is the Minnehaha County inmates. And what we've seen so far this year is a very gradual trend down, which is kind of surprising in a growing community that our jail numbers locally are going down. The rest of the bars on top with the different colors are the various entities that we contract with to house inmates. So particularly the yellow bar is the federal prisoners. Those are really the prisoners we use to provide the flex in the jail population to allow us to operate as efficiently as we can. The jail is currently configured with 603 beds. We operate best at about 513 inmates. So this bar along here is that 513 bar. So that's where we use those rental beds to stay as close to that 513 as we can. If we click over to the next slide, that's where I kind of talk about that 85%. That's what we're really looking to run at 85% of our total beds. What we've seen over the last 5 years, well, what we're seeing month to month this year is a very gradual trend down. Over the last 5 years, we're seeing things that are holding fairly consistent. With that fairly consistent holding of our jail population, we are seeing an increase of the inmates we're keeping. The crime severity or the charge severity is going up, while more lower level offenders are being managed outside of the jail, which is exactly the place I think we should be. If we have people that we can monitor safely outside of the jail, there's really no reason to keep them there. Let's utilize the programs that we've developed, monitor them outside of the jail environment, leaving room for us to hold the inmates that we actually do really need to hold. What we saw from 2019 is that this 8% increase in the class 3 felonies above, matching a 8% increase on the way down, or on the lower level felonies and misdemeanors. With the increase in charge severity, though, we are also seeing a slightly longer average length of stay. Average length of stay is a number we look at, but it's one that I personally, from a day-to-day operations of the jail, I don't find a tremendous amount of value in it, because it averages somebody that comes in on a minor misdemeanor and is there maybe 30 minutes with somebody who's there on a very complicated homicide that might be there for 3 years. So that average gets really skewed. I think, if we go to the next slide, Sam, this is just the breakdown from September 25th. So what you can see is we're at 350 for our local inmates. We house all of Lincoln County's prisoners, and then the federal marshal's prisoners is that 63. That's the number that will really fluctuate the most out of that bunch, as we have either available beds or we're having some pressure on our beds. The program that I think is, I think, because it's very hard to show with the actual stats as to how effective that program is the pretrial services program. I know we've talked about it before. This program has been a few years in the making and is really kind of coming into its own, and I give this program a lot of credit with us being able to maintain that jail population where we're at. They're currently monitoring about 305 people in that program, which, how that program works is when somebody comes into jail, the pretrial service program will meet with them and complete what's called a PSA, or a public safety assessment, that they present to the courts before that first appearance. The judge will review that, and then that provides the judge some additional information in making a bond determination. This program has allowed the judges a lot more information and therefore a lot more comfort to release some of these people on a personal recognizance bond, with pretrial services monitoring them and working with them to try to ensure that they appear in court for future court hearings. Pretrial will also be able then to refer them to various services in the community that they may find beneficial. This paragraph here with this stat I found really, really surprising and honestly quite impressive. They took a look at 801 people that they'd serviced through pretrial services in 2022 and 23, compared that to that same population in 20 and 21, and with the implementation of pretrial services for that group of people, they lowered their occurrence of fail to appear by 65%. That's a really big number, and it really shows the work that they're able to do with these people continuing to show up for court dates, continuing to move through the system. Clearly, this population tends to reoffend, so they're cycling through, since we're dealing with them in 20 and 21 and again in 22 and 23. But getting them through the court system, getting them held accountable for whatever crime they've committed and then moved into other services is obviously nothing but beneficial for the community as a whole, but the jail system in particular. With the reduction in fail to appears, that's a huge chunk and a big help for that jail population, but it also gets these folks routed into services that they can benefit them in the future and hopefully keep them out of jail. Another component of the jail, I think we've talked about 24/7. That program's been in place for a long time. We are currently sitting at a good number. That program, a lot of the 369 participants in that program will also be participants in the pretrial program. But while pretrial really works on the fail to appear, this program's really designed to try to prevent them from reoffending. Electronic monitoring is another. We used to do the old work release. This has replaced the work release. So this allows us for people to wear a GPS bracelet, and then we really closely monitor their schedule, require where they have to be and when they have to be there. Again, if it's somebody that we can successfully and safely monitor in their home rather than staying in jail, it just makes good sense to do that. With that, I think anybody else will answer any questions you may have.
Can you tell us the number on how many homicides are solved versus unsolved right
I'll
now?
leave that for now.
Yeah, so I don't have the exact data with me for the past years, but we have the 2 open cases right now for the last 5 years, so for this year.
Those are done.
Dunham, and then the one that was on the west side of town off the trailer court. So the rest had resulted in arrest and the follow through with prosecution and whatever the charges were. So.
Mayor, you've talked about in the past, by virtues of decisions made 130 years ago, that Sioux Falls has a state pen. and the DOC is talking about, obviously, a new state pen. Has the city had any interactions with DOC about where that might be located? Or your wishes?
Yes. So the question was about the state pen and the location of that. So I'm not going to get into the discussions we're having with the DOC on that. I will say that
But you
Safe
are having
South,
discussions.
that Safe South Dakota group that we have that is on a call every month, the DOC is part of that call. And the DOC has made it very clear that they feel the best place for a prison for the state of South Dakota is around Sioux Falls for the workforce and the infrastructure and other things. And so they're obviously pursuing a location right now that fits that. It's very close to Sioux Falls and would draw a lot of the workforce. So it's not in the city limits, so I don't have a lot of say on that at this point. But
would you like to see more, and I don't know particularly the state law, but it's the county of origin of these, essentially sending people back from whence they offended?
yeah, it's a great question. The question was, would we like to see here in Sioux Falls county of conviction release? So if you commit a crime in Bonham County and you get sentenced there and you serve time in the pen here and you get released, a lot of times they're released to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and not back to Bonham County. We're looking at that right now. There may be some further cooperation that we could do with the DOC on that level. I think one of the challenges is making sure that those people who are paroled or released have access to the services that they're going to require, and a lot of those are in Sioux Falls, so there's a natural tension there, that we know that a lot of the services that they need are going to be in our community, in our city. So better question though is, well, what are we doing to ensure that when men are released up the hill that they have the right resources and programming that they've been getting, so that when they are released they have access to get ID, get a job, get a resume, have gained some work, some skills, some workforce skills, so we can put them to work in our community and have them be safe and productive members of society here.
Does the state, do you think the state has more of a responsibility to provide more funding for the services in this community, for what we do have?
I think you can always make that argument. A third of the state lives in the Sioux Falls MSA, so that's just reality. So whether it be if you're homeless in the state, you end up in here, Rapid City. If you're a dude and you go to jail, you're going to probably go to jail here in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. So we end up with a disproportionate amount of that population here. So I think we're always open to discussions to say, hey, is the right amount of funding and resources being allocated to Sioux Falls, given the population base that we serve compared to the rest of the state. Other questions?
Could you just verbalize a little bit back on the crime rate? That we talk about this every time you have this briefing. The perception versus the reality. How can we possibly convince people, particularly those out in the state, who think that there's, what's wrong in Sioux Falls? I get that question all the time, and it's just not based in reality. What's your message?
Well, one message I have is, the media doesn't cover all the planes that land safely every day. But if one crashes, that's the story. And so we have thousands and thousands and thousands of good, positive interactions every day. Our clearance rate on cases is incredible. But all it takes is one homicide for that to be a story for a week long. And that creates a narrative that there's crime. And when you looked at those drug seizure numbers that are way high, there is hundreds and hundreds of hours that went into those seizures that kept that off the street and likely kept crime off the street as a result. So there's so much good happening. I don't know how else to foot stomp that other than to say, here's the data, and I'm a data guy, and that crime per capita number shows that if that 4 to 5 violent crimes per capita was 6, 7, 8, 9 over the last 5 years, we'd have a very different briefing today that we'd have to be talking about. So the data's telling us it's still a very safe and livable community.
When you talk about violent crime, a lot of times we hear the violent crime involves people who knew each other. It's not necessarily some stranger coming up and beating you over the head or beating you up and taking your wallet per se. Or it's, you know, the homicides don't typically involve strangers just randomly shooting people. So when you talk about violent crime going down, what about the day-to-day stuff, like even my car being stolen, or somebody breaking into my shed, or, I mean, what's that like? Because that's the stuff that affects people in every neighborhood.
Yeah, you know, maybe let Assistant Chief talk to that too, but what we just showed here is whether that's robberies, whether that's stolen vehicles, we've probably added, since the last time we did this briefing, another 2,000 to 3,000 people in this community, and yet we've seen decreases in those numbers. So that's what I would tell Joe Public, is that despite us being one of the 25 fastest growing cities in the country, we're still seeing decreases year over year in some of those really key areas. And I think that's what success looks like. You're never going to get to a point in a community where your crime numbers are gone. It's a tension to be managed. So it's a question of how well are you managing that tension, and how well are you managing that tension of growth. And to me, I look at a lot of these numbers today as good numbers and successful numbers in a community that's really grasping in all areas with growth, because we're growing at a very, very rapid clip right now. Related to that, though, if I can just foot stomp it for a minute, is we need men and women who want to do this work to make sure we stay safe. We talk about that a ton, and that's why we have recruiting campaigns, and we need, you know, Sam Clemenses and Nick Cooks and people who are willing to answer the call to do this work. And that's the next thing that, honestly, what keeps me up at night more than any numbers you saw here today is ensuring that in 5, 6, 7 years from now, we have a police force that's at authorized strength, and that we haven't vilified a profession too much that keeps people from wanting to do this work, because it's very important work, it's very valuable work, it's very needed work. You got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I can add to your question, because you talk about violent crime, and I mean, obviously that's one of the big focusing drivers on how we address the violent acts, right? And then you mentioned stolen cars and somebody breaking into your shed. May not necessarily be violent, but what's it tied to, right? And those aren't pushed to the wayside. So Chief Toom, the mayor, talked about our violent crimes unit last year or a year and a half ago when we brought them in to focus on these really violent offenders that are causing a lot of the havoc out there and hurting people. And they've done a great job. And I do have some numbers I can share with you just for this year. But back to your question about breaking into sheds and stolen cars and all that stuff. And we can be proactive as we can be, right? Like if there's a problem area, we saturate it overnights with our patrol guys. Like if they know somebody's breaking into construction sites or houses in this area, they're just like the sheriff's office does. They'll go and be visible and look for anything that may be out of place at 2 or 3 in the morning. But we talked about with stolen cars, what can we do? All of us, right? It's back to the fact that unfortunately, and it's sad to say, we don't live in a nation or a world that we can just leave our doors open or our cars unlocked or our gun under our seat anymore, because people are going to take advantage of it. So what can we do? We secure our stuff. We see something going on, we call it in, at least have us come look and see what exactly is going on with somebody if they're being suspicious. Those are all things that can be done from the community standpoint. We can't be everywhere at once. We try to be, but we can't be. It's just physically impossible. The violent crime stuff, again, like we really shifted that focus. We got rid of, we reimagined our street crimes unit, which was kind of doing that in a way, but also looking at gang activity. Well, everything's connected, right? So we rebranded it Violent Crimes Unit, and they've put a focus on those hard drivers of who's out there shooting guns, assaulting people. Just this year alone, they've taken just them, and we have other people doing proactive stuff. They've taken 40 firearms off the street, arrested 77 people. And this stat was given to me to the end of July, so nothing current. But they have recovered 26 stolen cars in the process of arresting these people. So when we talk about stolen cars being connected to violent crime, that is a perfect example of how it's connected. And that doesn't count for the ones that got away, like when they're focusing on something. So, and then a keynote with that violent crime unit, we have great federal and local partners that they join with, the Homeland Security, DEA, FBI, Marshals. They all join with us to do these operations. They have tools we don't have available to us. and they help us catch these people that we need to catch. So hopefully I answered your question.
Yeah, I'm
But
gonna ask it a little bit different way.
yeah,
Because what do you consider nonviolent crimes and what's the status of those? And when I think of nonviolent crimes, I think of, yeah, somebody broke into my shed, somebody did this or that. I'm probably not gonna be involved in a shooting at this point.
right.
Yeah, as a
Yeah,
regular
okay.
citizen, so.
Yeah, so difficult thing to track, but we use it with our clearance rate that the mayor talked about. So there are clearance rate to show the larceny, burglaries. I was just up talking to our detectives the other day, and they're constantly walking over warrants to Mr. Hagar's office for those crimes. So are they all solvable? Not necessarily. Like some of the car break-ins where we have no information, no video, no witnesses, they're very tough, right? But it's just the nature of it's always been that way. But when we have evidence and we have a way to pursue it, they're taken over to the state's attorney's office and usually prosecuted.
Mr. Tenhagen had mentioned that, like, you need more people who want to do this work. Is there
Yes.
currently a law enforcement shortage, or are you just saying?
No,
because
it's
more-
been, well, we've talked about it for 4 years now since, COVID. And then there was a perception change of law enforcement nationally, right? So there was a dip, right? Currently, we're down 18 officers. So when we're always looking for people, but we have people that retire that hit the end of their career, and we need people to step up and fill their shoes. So we did the recruitment campaign that Chief Toom came and talked about a couple months ago. Saw some positivity with that and an increase in applications. But if we all think about what we want as a community, I'm not going to be here forever. Clemens will probably be here forever, but I will not be. But we need somebody to fill our shoes, right? And do this job 20 years from now. And that's what we look for is the future, right? And being 18 officers down in a 300 officer department doesn't seem like a lot, but it's a lot when it's busy, right? So we need the right people to do this job the right way. So
And then I wanted to ask about Mr. Tenhagen and Mr. Hager had mentioned like legislation you want to bring on this subject. Can you get into a little more detail of what language you might want to see or the kind of penalties?
Every year, we meet with law enforcement partners, kind of talk through what we've seen, areas in the law where it feels like we could try and fill gaps. The big one this year is on that reckless driving, that street racing, the potential for those street takeovers. I think that the language that we're working on right now, and again, nothing's official until it's signed by the governor. We'll also talk with legislators on that, but trying to make it very clear what behavior is unlawful. And then what those penalties are. So I think that you'll see proposed legislation, again, in the organized racing, organized street takeover, making that met with punishment, whether that's felony or misdemeanor. I'm trying to make sure that those individuals understand very clearly it's not tolerated in our communities because of the danger it provides to other drivers.
Daniel, do you have some lawmakers that you are working with on this then?
We always have local lawmakers who are interested in good ideas, whether those ultimately pass or not. Last year we had Representative Cole had helped us with the bill to make it a crime to try and disarm law enforcement, had a lot of support with the aggravated eluding causing injury and death, updating those statutes. We've got good local lawmakers. We have a lot of support across the state from others. When they see good law enforcement supporting bills, it's kind of nice to see the volunteers to carry that legislation.
When did these Save South Dakota calls start happening, the collaboration?
Well, they've been going on. The question was, when did we start having these collaborative Safe South Dakota calls? Probably about 2 years ago now, maybe. Would that be right? We started having these, and we had them in response to, it kind of goes into the question here. You ask, well, what are we doing about crime? And the answer was usually, well, as soon as they commit a crime, we catch them. We have a very good track record of catching criminals. And some of the guys and gals that we catch, we've caught 8, 10, a dozen times. But there's multifaceted parts to the justice system. There's the cops that enforce, but then the state's attorney has to bring charges, and then it has to go into the courts, and the courts has to decide how to sentence, and then they get into incarceration, and then there's parole and DOC involved. And so we're only one leg of that stool in enforcement. So sometimes when people say, well, what are you doing about homicides? It's like, well, we've arrested some of these people 10 times. So we're doing all we can do, but there's other legs of the stool that are all important in this. So that's why it is rare to have a state's attorney stand alongside us and talk about this, because a lot of times there's conflict. He's got his own leg of the stool. We got our own leg of the stool. And we have to understand each other and the nuances with each other. So those calls came together about that, to say to the DOC and UJS, the justice system, what are we doing with repeat offenders? Because a lot of what Assistant Chief Cook showed you today in those bar charts, there's a lot of repeat offenders in all those numbers, a lot of repeat offenders. And so those are what we worry about most. Not the one-time kid that jacked a car and he's going to get in trouble and hopefully never do it again. It's the person who's done it 20 times. It's like, okay, we got to figure out how to deal with those challenges. And sometimes it's a legislative issue that maybe needs to be addressed. So a truth in sentencing law was put into place as a result of, say, South Dakota, that said, if you have an offense that meets these criteria, you will serve, is it 85 to 100% of what you were sentenced to serve. Because I think a lot of times the community is surprised to hear when we have a violent crime that we arrested that guy 2 years ago, he got a 9-year sentence, he got out in 12 months, and he committed that crime. It's like we had him, we just released him again, and then he committed a crime again. So that's the point of those calls, is to figure out how we can do this work better.
You said earlier that city growth keeps you up at night in regards to crime and violent crime. Would you say then that recruiting for the police department is one of your number one priorities at the city level?
It's a top priority for sure. It's the recruiting for police officers is the hardest position to fill in city government. Cops. And they're all hard. IT, cybersecurity people, public health people, they're engineers. We compete with the private sector for that. But getting people who want to put on that uniform and do this work every day is hard.
What do you think steers the public clear of signing up?
Well, I mean,
do you think it's a nationwide thing?
It's a nationwide thing. And I'll tell you, if I'm being candid, we vilified a profession 4 years ago that we're still recovering from. And we made that badge look bad 4 years ago. And it's not. There's bad cops, but there's bad politicians, there's bad journalists, there's bad pastors. And so we luckily have bucked that trend here, but we continually are swimming upstream right now to make sure that this is a profession that people want to get involved in. We protect the brand of Sioux Falls PD and of law enforcement and public safety, because it's a very noble profession to do in this town. And we have some of the best doing it.
To be clear, 4 years ago,
The pandemic and social justice challenges that we experienced around the world, really. All right, well, thanks for coming today. We appreciate it. Have a blessed and safe rest of your week. All right.